This is an Empty Closet Radio podcast. Get more at facebook.com/emptyclosetradio.
Hi, I'm Andrew.
And I'm Sam.
And this is The Empty Closet.
The show for everyone, whether you're in the closet
Or out and proud. Or
somewhere in between.
Talking about making things specifically for you and unique fashion, Sam, you showed me these amazing shirts that are from an online store, which we're not going to say the name, but, you know, if you really want to find out, you can probably look on our social media and we might have something about it there. One of them they have all these slogans on them, and they're like words that you wouldn't ordinarily see on t-shirts. One of them was decolonize your bookshelf. And I said to Sam, I'm like, I don't get that one. Like, some of them were really obvious and I did understand them. I particularly want the one with the peach on it. If anyone wants to purchase that for me, I feel it will be very appropriate.
I think it would be too. But back to the one you don't understand, decolonizing your bookshelf. Do you understand what those words mean individually?
Well, bookshelf, yes.
Do you know what decolonization is?
Well, so part of me thinks about like an ant colony, and I'm like, I'm pretty sure that's not what we're talking about. Colonization in the version of like the British going and invading the entire world. Is that what we're talking about? Colonization?
Well, it wasn't just the British. Let's be specific here. Most Western European nations and the US had their own colonies. And you could make the argument for Australia and some of the smaller islands that are Australian territories. But anyway, totally different discussion. But so colonization was the process by which Europeans... How is it put? They took over the world with the cunning use of flags, but basically that they suppressed native culture in the places that they made colonies in order to use the land, the resources, the people for their own good.
They invented flags, didn't tell anyone what they signified, and then like ran around erecting them everywhere.
Yeah, there's a lot of horrible things to do with colonization, but one of the big things that happens with colonization is the dominant culture is not necessarily the culture of the most people. So, for instance, in colonized African nations, it wasn't that black culture was still dominant and held all the power because all the people were black. The people who have money, their culture is the dominant one. So in the West, the dominant culture is the normal, the average is the white, middle class to wealthy, heterosexual, vaguely Christian or atheist male. He's cisgendered and he's probably a little bit conservative. And that's the default, and everything else differs from that.
So basically you're saying I'm almost the default, except that I like boys.
Pretty close.
Pretty accurate.
So, and this is where a lot of things like we can't have a female lead in a movie because no one would associate with them, or we changed the background characters' races so that everyone would feel comfortable with them, and it's something set in the Middle East and all the people are white. Like, you know, things like this. Things like this are the result of colonization. So when you decolonize something, you attempt to remove the assumption that the best or most normal or the most quality things produced from a society are produced by cis-het white men. So you try to take away that assumption.
So this is similar to like when people are interviewing like musicians and stuff, they'll have them play for them, but there'll be like some kind of visual blocking thing so they can't see who it is that's playing.
Yeah, and it's also about boosting voices or boosting information that challenges the assumption that the norm is the only way. So in this respect, decolonizing your bookshelf is like, have a look at your bookshelf. Are the vast majority of authors white Western men? Maybe think about buying a book from someone who's not a white Western man.
Which, whether we like it or not, might mean don't buy the one that's on the end of the aisle that they have heaps of.
Although it depends. Some of the bookshops are working around that. So this is something that I've actually been making a bit of a personal goal of for a little while now, because my bookshelf was pretty good in some respects. I had closer to gender parity than most people do, but I didn't always have the most varied backgrounds, particularly for my fiction. So I've been making a real effort to purchase fictional books from authors whose culture is not my own. And also non-fiction books that are about cultures that aren't my own, or that examine my assumptions about my own culture.
And you know how you like to keep me honest, Sam? Well, I'm going to try and keep you honest. I've gotten all these books off your bookshelf. Let's have a look at them. There's one here called, this is the first one that comes off the bookshelf. It's very thick. Mind you, you're talking to someone who doesn't really have a bookshelf in their house. And it's called The Invisible Man. What is the significance of this book? By the way, have you read it? Doesn't look opened.
I've read part of it. I'm struggling a bit with it, not because it's boring, but because it's very confronting to read at times. So this is not the H.G. Wells Invisible Man. This is not a guy who's literally invisible and wraps himself in bandages. This is considered in the States by many people the first great African American novel. So this was a man writing about his experiences as an African American man and how he was invisible to society. He was a nothing person. He was used by people.
Is this written like when slavery was still a thing and like he's still considered like property, or are we talking like he's actually not a slave anymore and he just still feels invisible?
No, this is after official slavery ended. I do have a book that is a non-fiction account of slavery, which is 12 Years a Slave. And that one's been made into a movie, and the ending is really quite depressing. But this is a fictional account. This is very much a, like, early 20th century kind of vibe, I guess.
Ah, okay. All right. Well, 12 Years a Slave is the very next book that's on your bookshelf. And this has, well, I can say that I have seen the movie and never read the book. Is it different? Is the book different to the movie very much?
There's just, well, for me, there's more in it. And this is a first person account, 12 Years a Slave. This is actually the man who lived for 12 years as a slave after he was kidnapped. There's a really great little glossary at the back about kind of racist terms that are used in classical literature, which is also really good for decolonizing your bookshelf.
Yeah, this is amazing. I'm going to learn some new words. Though, mind you, there are words that I actually do know what they mean, like smallpox. I love that we have to actually define what smallpox is because, like, it was a real thing.
Empty Closet Radio. Listen to us using your TuneIn radio app on your smartphone. Very smart.
Raised Cane. Raised Cane. This is in, like, the glossary for, well, it's not really a glossary, it's like definitions of words at the back. It's a miniature dictionary. At the back of your book, 12 Years a Slave, because we're talking about decolonizing Sam's bookshelf. And it means caused a lot of trouble. And where do you think the saying came from?
I'm gonna go out on a limb and guess it's a racist saying.
Not really. It's like a biblical saying. So, raised Cain, I know, you could take that so many ways. Raised Cain, when I first read it, I thought that it was like a cane, like, you know, in old schools, like maybe you'd get the cane as punishment. And I thought raised Cain would be like somebody getting ready to give you punishment. No, that's not where it's from. Apparently, raised Cain means caused a lot of trouble. Cain is a character in the Bible who killed his brother Abel. So that's where it came from.
Maybe that's why it's called a cane. Who knows? More research is needed. But anyway, so decolonizing Sam's bookshelf. You should all decolonize your bookshelves because you learn many, many interesting things. Now, one of the ways that you can decolonize your bookshelf is really nifty. If you go online, there are a bunch of different websites that enable you to back somebody's project, like crowdfunding, crowdsourcing. And it's a way for a lot of books to get published that wouldn't necessarily see the light of day otherwise. So one of the ones that I crowdfunded early, I participated in the crowdfunding earlier this year that I'm really enjoying is called Habibi, and it's Muslim authors from around the world writing love stories. So this is a very different cultural background to myself, but it's also different cultural backgrounds within the book. And these are authors that I would never have found otherwise, because they're certainly not authors I would see on the bookshelf in my bookshop.
And they're very difficult to find, unique authors, really.
Yeah, so more and more, I've also just backed a book. I don't have it yet, but I have to tell you about it. It's not decolonizing my bookshelf because the author is the same race as me, but she's a comic book author that I really love. And she wrote a fan fiction about a gay couple that has been accepted into publishing, and they're pre-selling copies. They need to pre-sell 500 copies. So it's a queer historical romance set in Scotland. And basically she's having to go this way because people kept telling her that queer romance doesn't sell, historical fiction doesn't sell. So she's like, fuck you all, I'm going to do it myself. So I'm very excited to get that book.
Yes, that sounds amazing.
It's so good.
There's another book that you've got listed here. Is this one of your crowdsourced ones as well? It's called Say You're One of Them.
No, I haven't read this one for a while, actually. I got this one when I was at university the first time from my then partner, was not someone for decolonizing his bookshelf, but he did watch a lot of non-English movies, although they were still very European. But he had a lot of writer friends, and one of them gave me this book, and this is, it's basically a story about violence in Africa, but specifically in Rwanda.
Rwanda, the war-torn country that everybody loves to hate. The writer on the front of the book says that it's a story that gets closer to the truth than any of the Western media really purveys.
And that's a big thing. I think that one of the big things I like about social media, and a big part of seeking out books like this, is that you find it is very difficult. It is very difficult to understand how your own background affects your perspective. You see it in generations where, like, people tend to think generations older than themselves are the product of their generation, and generations younger than themselves are idiots. But they never think that they themselves are the product of their own generation. They think that they are perfectly logical creatures. And it's the same when you think about your cultural background. So people assume that what they take as a given is a given everywhere. And so by seeking out authors who are writing about this is why there's a debate about whether you should write about people as an author that are not like you. So there's this ongoing debate about whether, you know, a white Australian author should be writing a book centered on a young black African female in the 50s in Ethiopia or something.
And do you think they should?
I think that I would rather have that book than have another book about white suburbia. But I also ask, why aren't we publishing black Ethiopian female authors who are writing about black Ethiopian females? You know, like, why is the only voice the white author? Why are they the only people getting published?
I don't know, Sam. Maybe it's around access.
Yeah, access, inbuilt prejudice, things like that.
Surely it's majority access.
We'll come back to this point.
Empty Closet Radio. Like us on Facebook.
But what about for someone like me, Sam, who doesn't have a bookshelf? Like, literally, I don't have one in my house. I have a small collection of books that people have given me in a bottom drawer somewhere in my house. I can rummage around and find it. But the vast majority of the reading that I do is really on the screen. So how do you go about trying to figure out whether you've got a diverse selection of authors when a lot of it just comes down the pipeline of social media?
Okay, so you need to actually find sources. So, for instance, if you're in Australia and you're consuming Australian news, for instance, and opinion pieces, a really good way to get some alternative viewpoints is to follow SBS, because SBS not only talks about stories that aren't getting attention in other mainstream media, but they'll also talk about the background of the author at the end of the article. So NITV will have a lot of articles about Indigenous Australians and Indigenous peoples in other places. And normally they will say the author is, their family group is this family group, they live in this place, they were born here. They will give you a background. So it will give you an idea of the perspective that this is coming from, particularly if it's an opinion piece. But you can also find world news there there that you won't touch on in other places. So it's a really good place to start. But you basically have to do some researching. You can't just get everything in, 240 characters?
But Sam, I want my world automated. I want all this work done for me.
But an automated world is how you get the normal at the top. You have to work to dismantle this, Andrew. It takes effort.
All right, so I may have I am actually making some effort to do this. It's mainly, it's not just about reading things, but also with what I do is I listen to a lot of my news and current affairs. And, yes, you're correct. SBS is one of my main sources, mainly because I feel like they're very unbiased. Anyway,
No, but that's a fair point. You have to try to find things that give you enough information that you can make up your own mind. Or if they have a bias, they talk about why. Like, they talk about the perspective they're coming from so you can grasp it. But you'll also, I know that we recommend podcasts to each other, but within podcasts that are already diverse, follow the suggestions they give you. Seek out websites that are known for being inclusive. Look and not just for news, but actually, if you're like, I'm really interested in hearing a story today, try to find it from someone whose name is not typically European. For instance, might be a good place to start.
So an article written by Bob Smith is not a great place to start.
Well, if Bob Smith is an archaeologist and has their doctorate and is talking about how everything is skewed because of these reasons, and he's going to explain a new perspective on a culture he spent 50 years studying, that's worth a listen to, but you should also still listen to voices from that culture.
Ah, yes, I see.
Maybe don't listen to the guy at the pub.
Right. Well, okay, so here's the strategy that I have in place already. This is a little bit of decolonizing my bookshelf. I am now realizing that actually my bookshelf, my modern version of the bookshelf, is really in my podcast feed, and what are the stories that I'm listening to in there. I listened to this one podcast that was, I think it's called Queer Voices, and it was about, it's actually published somewhere from Africa, maybe South Africa. I'm not quite sure. But they talk about queer issues that are affecting their community there, then and there. And it's really interesting that some of the issues I'm that's not relevant to me. But the vast majority of issues that they speak about, I'm oh yeah, this is applicable to my world and my experience and even my perspective of the world. So really interesting.
And what you also find, if you, I put up an article on my social media page a few weeks ago now that you'd probably appreciate. And it was somebody writing who was a young Muslim woman who's bisexual. And she was talking about how there are issues within her own culture and talking about them, but also talking about the issues within when she tries to enter queer spaces. And talking about the assumptions of the queer community, because just because a group or an individual is discriminated against in one sense doesn't mean they're not doesn't mean that they don't discriminate against others. And this is something that I think that the rainbow community is grappling with, not always successfully, but by introducing those divergent voices, hopefully we'll have progress.
Yeah, absolutely. I can just imagine if you face discrimination in one area of your life and then you face it in a separate area of your life, you'd just be looking for where is that safe space all the time.
And that's exactly it. There's not the safe space for one group is not always the safe space for another group, even if they think it is. So one way to dismantle that is to introduce voices of different backgrounds and different cultures and things like that to broaden your understanding of the world and maybe challenge what you think about.
Thanks for listening to The Empty Closet, brought to you by 1019 Coast FM Cairns.